Unless we do something about it, the nation's debt is on a path to grow to unsustainable levels over the coming decades. The good news is that we can do something about it. By planning ahead, we can make decisions about how to reduce our annual deficits over the long term. Then, once our economy is stronger, we can follow through on our plans to put our nation on a sustainable fiscal path. Over the next few minutes, we'll review key facts about our federal budget and the fiscal challenges that face us. A helpful starting place is to understand what makes up our federal budget. The government funds thousands of programs, both large and small, from national defense and foreign assistance to education and research. But a handful of programs dominate the budget. This year, 20% of all spending will go to Medicare and Medicaid. 19% will go to Social Security. And 18% will go to what are known as other mandatory spending programs. About 19% of spending will go to national defense, and 19% to other domestic and international programs. 5% of our budget will be used to pay off interest on our debt. Federal revenues come from the taxes, fees, and other collections that are received by the government every year. This year, about 43% of revenues come from individual income taxes, 40% come from social insurance and retirement taxes, which generally go to pay for Social Security and Medicare, 7% from the corporate income taxes, 3% from taxes on special products like gas and tobacco, and 6% from other taxes. The difference between our spending and our revenues is our deficit, which occurs in any year the government spends more money than it takes in, and it must borrow to cover the difference. Our nation's publicly held debt is the sum of each year's budget deficits throughout the nation's history. Deficit spending is not necessarily a bad thing. Governments often borrow money to invest in future needs. But over the coming decades, rising debt levels threaten to harm our economy and lead to lower living standards. Our nation's highest debt ever, right after World War II, was just over 100% of the size of our economy. That means that for a brief period of time, our total debt was about the same level as the nation's entire economic output. Today, our publicly held debt is about 60% of the size of our economy. Future projections show us reaching debt levels of 100% in about 10 years and continuing to increase steadily in the years to come. The federal government has often generated budget deficits. In fact, the government has balanced the budget only 12 times since the end of World War II, most recently in the years from 1998 to 2001, when the federal government ran a surplus and paid down some of the debt. But the deficits we will face in the coming decades are large and persistent, and the further out we look, the larger they will be. The first consequence of taking on debt is the need to pay interest on the amount we borrow. As debt increases, interest costs will take up a larger percentage of our budget. This will leave less money for other national priorities and reduce our nation's ability to respond to new threats. The interest rates we pay on our debt will also go up the more we have to borrow, as we need to attract more and more money from lenders. This will lead to higher consumer interest rates on everything from mortgages to car loans, and will affect large and small businesses that need investments to expand and create new jobs. Rising deficits and debt in the coming decades will be driven largely by rising healthcare costs and an aging population. Compounding the challenge are the large tax cuts that policymakers enacted over the last decade. Healthcare inflation drives the problem because it causes Medicare and Medicaid costs to grow much more quickly than economic growth and federal budget resources can keep up with. Aging will lead to increased spending on 3 of the country's largest programs: Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. As more citizens become eligible for the programs and more people live longer lives, there will be fewer workers paying taxes to support those receiving benefits. Unfortunately, there are no magic bullets or shortcuts we can take to avoid making tough choices. The options for reducing the deficit over the long term will require us to either cut spending, raise revenues, or some combination of the two. Many programs that are often talked about as sources of wasteful spending that could be cut to reduce the deficit are simply not large enough to make a difference over the long term. For example, common solutions that are often mentioned, like cutting down on waste, fraud, and abuse, congressional earmarks, foreign aid, or corporate tax write-offs, are not large enough to put us on a sustainable fiscal path. And while strengthening our economy will be essential because it will increase revenues and reduce costs, not even a return to the strong, sustained economic growth of the 1990s would eliminate the deficit. We simply cannot grow ourselves out of the problem. The good news is that we do have options for addressing our long-term fiscal challenges. During the national discussion, you will consider a wide array of options that include cutting spending and raising revenues. And if you want, you can add new options to the mix. All of the options will be focused on policies that can be taken over the long term, after our economy has recovered. This will give us time to enact the policies we choose and will ensure that our actions do not threaten our economic recovery. By finding agreement among these options, we will send a strong signal to our leaders and the world about our commitment to address our long-term problems. The federal budget is an expression of our priorities as a people. Together, we must identify what is most important to us and plan ahead for a bright future.